because people failed to accept and explore the alternative hypothesis, which turned out to be factually correct.
Who does that? Who calls somebody by their first, middle, and last name? Isn't that kind of weird? Isn't that kind of culty? He's not Martin, but Martin Luther King. Contrary to what Republicans would like to imagine, Martin supported reparations and he supported affirmative action.
This is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Any attempts by Republicans to make Martin into something their own is both false and a recipe for defeat. Now, it's hard to remember when the first accusations were made, but at least since the 1970s, probably well before that, there were claims that Martin was a communist, not a real doctor, and that he had sex orgy parties. In 1991, after around 2 decades of denial, Boston University finally admitted that Martin plagiarized parts of his PhD thesis. Boston University formed a committee to investigate the plagiarism and found that Martin stole, verbatim, 33% of his dissertation, 45% of the first half, and 21% of the second half from another Boston University student, Jack Boozer. And that's just what the committee found. I suspect if a more hostile committee was looking at Martin's thesis, they would have found more plagiarism than that. Not surprisingly, the Boston University committee did not recommend revoking King's doctorate, despite a third of it being proven to be plagiarized. But this makes perfect sense, given that his speeches were written by others. For example, Martin's I Have a Dream speech was written by One thing that always stuck out at me like a sore thumb was how the white people in very lily white states will lecture whites in the southeast US just how bad their negative views of black people are. And this always seemed a glaring falsification of the idea of prejudice, that white people with greater proximity towards blacks, but presumably this would work with other races, have a more negative view of those races than those whose views of other races is delivered to them electronically, or is informed by that black family that lives in their otherwise all-white neighborhood. And we've been over South Africa, how white people in the United Kingdom or in Holland and Western Europe sat in moral judgment with radically different views about what was going on in majority black South Africa, and how mean and prejudiced the whites in South Africa were being to set up laws designed to quarantine the blacks in South Africa. But now I want to go over a similar situation that happened in the United States. And I've read through, not necessarily cover to cover, but through several books about black people during what is called the Great Migration out of the South starting around 1890. And some of them talk about a single city, some talk about multiple cities, but it's all a variation on a theme about what happened in all these places. Before the end of slavery in the United States, only about 10% of the blacks in the US were freedmen. And it's very important to distinguish between these two groups of blacks. I will refer to the antebellum freedmen, or free blacks who got their freedom before the Civil War, and postbellum freedmen who got their freedom from Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. These are two very different groups, and they function very differently. The Emancipation Proclamation occurred in 1863, though it only really went into effect in 1865 when the war actually ended. And northern cities around 1800 had race segregation laws. Laws limiting voting, laws limiting kinds and forms of employment, laws limiting property that blacks could have. However, as you get into the 1830s and 1840s, not only do these laws go away, but at least according to the authors I read, they describe a more liberal spirit toward the Negro, quote unquote, emerging. For example, in 1860, before the Civil War began a year later, there wasn't a single neighborhood in Detroit that was more than 50% black, i.e., there were no majority black neighborhoods. There was no black ghetto. In Chicago, 2/3 of blacks lived in majority white neighborhoods, and the majority black areas were not considered ghettos. But then the Great Migration happened. And this is a period from about 1890 to 1910 where postbellum blacks started a mass movement out of the South into northern cities. And in all of these accounts, like clockwork, they say that the cities began to go back to segregation in various forms. And it wasn't always by law that this happened, as was the case in the South, but sometimes by organization and norm. Restrictive covenants would do the trick, which was just a deal that if you sold your house or rented it, it had to be sold or rented to a white person. If that was struck down by a judge as illegal, another thing that kept white neighborhoods white was just pricing. Just like today, whites with money just bought nicer places, and very few blacks could afford a nice place. And even those blacks who could afford a nice place weren't really that bad to be around anyway, especially since this is before widespread affirmative action. So the rich areas don't really need segregation, which is perhaps why being racist, quote unquote, became more associated with poor whites, as it was the poor whites who actually had to deal with these post-bellum blacks on a regular basis. But if you didn't have money and the court struck down a restrictive covenant, well, then your home and your neighborhood got destroyed by these post-bellum blacks. And I say this now, and it's something considered really mean and racist to say, that you bring blacks into an area and that destroys the area. But all these authors back then chronicling at the times, they just said it like this, even the black ones, because back then the norm that you couldn't say what was clearly going on, what clearly happened when blacks moved into an area, the norm that you couldn't say that hadn't been established yet, nor did any of all the narratives we have. For example, all of these guys talk about post-bellum blacks being more criminal and prone to vice and indolence, and narratives regarding police bias hadn't developed yet, so they would just say that the blacks were more criminal and this was bad, and this made it difficult for good things to happen, for people to develop careers, and for people, it made it hard for a community to form and any kind of collective economic stability to occur. What's also funny is that they would say that slavery had something to do with the problems of the post-bellum black communities as they moved into the North, but they would say that it was the poor work ethic that they developed as slaves. Now, I know, and you could know if you wanted to, that black slaves in the South actually worked fewer hours per year than free white farmers did at the time, and certainly they weren't self-motivated. And I have a series talking about slavery that goes into all sorts of things like this, and it's linked in the description. But what's also interesting is that these guys writing about the past, they don't think as deterministically as sociologists do today. For example, an explanation for why a group behaves a certain way could be just that that group chose to act that way. Why did a person mug this other person? Well, because you chose to be immoral and you chose to do that. Why are so many blacks in these northern cities engaging in vice and indolence? Well, because they are doing that. They made the choice to do that. That's not a way modern sociologists tend to think. They could just look at a group behaving a certain way and say that that group shouldn't be behaving that way, and that the solution is to muster up the will to stop behaving that way. Sociologists today definitely do not think like this. To them, everything is ultimately determined by circumstance, however complicated it may seem. Now, ending that digression, the same thing that happened into cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and New York also happened on the West Coast a little bit, in San Francisco and Portland, Oregon in World War II, when blacks started moving in to help with the naval buildup. San Francisco went from 5,000 blacks in 1940 to 40,000 blacks in 1950. And over that time, there became more restrictive covenants and white-only stores and restaurants throughout San Francisco. Now, segregation on the West Coast isn't as well known because the Civil Rights Act was passed 15 years later due to the influx of European Jews to the United States after World War II. But for a brief period, it also happened on West Coast cities as well, illustrating, and that's important because it illustrates that this is a universal phenomenon. This is not something specific to southern cities or the South in general, or to northern cities at a specific place in time, but it also occurred in the West Coast. It also occurred in South Africa. This is a universal phenomenon. When blacks move in, whites have a instinctive reaction to segregate somehow. And today, the way whites segregate is different. It has to do with the buildup of the suburbs and leaving the cities, and the cities become what they become. So why did all of this happen? Why did all of these cities go from being open to blacks before the 1890s to being closed to blacks once the post-bellum freedmen started moving in? Well, there's a true dichotomy of explanation here. One is the obvious explanation that pops out at you, and the other is circles within circles retardation. So we'll skip the shitlib circus explanation here, and we'll just go with what actually happened. The antebellum, right? Remember, the antebellum freedmen were the blacks who found a way to not be slaves, either buying it or doing a favor or whatever it is they had to do to find a way to stop being slaves. And so the difficulty of becoming a freedman before 1865, however difficult that was, I'm not exactly sure how hard that was, but whatever difficulty that was, that served as a filter. And I'm just gonna have to be kind of rude about this, but it was obviously the higher quality blacks who managed to achieve freedom before general emancipation. This couldn't not be the case. It wasn't going to be on average worse quality people who managed to earn their freedom before general emancipation. Now sure, there could be some who just got lucky, but on the whole, the 10% of blacks who got their freedom were going to be smarter, better able to delay gratification, better able to plan ahead than the blacks who didn't manage to get their freedom before 1865. Unfortunately, statistics back then weren't as detailed as they are now, and it would be unlikely that the blacks in Detroit or Philadelphia in 1850, 13 years before Lincoln's General Emancipation Proclamation, would be exactly as wealthy as their fellow whites at the time were. Maybe the antebellum blacks were slightly poorer or slightly wealthier than their white peers in these cities, but the general perception was that of equality. So whatever the slight difference was, in whatever direction it went, wasn't noticeable to people at the time, or to people chronicling what was going on. And we can do some fuzzy math to get an idea of what free black IQ would have been back then. Now, one problem is that black slaves were mostly illiterate back then. Only about 20% could read, which was higher than the world average, also higher than Russia at the time, which was 15%. So black slaves, in a global sense, had it pretty good in terms of being literate. But what this means, though, when comparing IQs, we're really talking about a kind of genetic IQ potential, or what their IQs would have been if they weren't illiterate. So blacks today, their mean IQ is around 85 with a standard deviation of 13. So the top, not 15. So the top 10% of blacks today would start at an IQ of 101.6, slightly above the white average. However, the selection for IQ in earning freedom probably wasn't as strong, as again, there would be those blacks who just got lucky, and there would also be some really smart blacks who couldn't earn their freedom because their lord just wouldn't loosen his grip at all. And so if this number here isn't so much a minimum but an average, well then we're looking at antebellum freedmen having an IQ of around 102. Now, if you think that the mean black genetic IQ was only 83 back then, because they had less white admixture at then, which is going to pull up, the average black quote-unquote IQ, as blacks today are around 24% European by admixture, and of course we're dealing with racial hereditarian assumptions, then by my assumptions here, we would predict the IQ of antebellum freedmen to have an average IQ of around 99.7. So these 10% of the blacks who were able to earn their freedom before the Civil War probably represented around the top 20% of blacks in terms of intelligence, ability to plan ahead, delay gratification, have self-control, etc. And we're not going to have trait regression to the mean that I talked about previously, because being able to earn your freedom isn't necessarily just selecting for IQ, but also selecting for these other things that you need to have in order to earn your freedom. Normally, when you have a black person with an IQ of 100, he still tends to have lower self-control, lower ability to plan ahead, lower ability to think abstractly than a white person with a similar IQ. So normally I would say if you have a population of blacks with an IQ of 100, they're still going to be slightly lower, not quite as low as the black average and all these other traits, but they're going to sort of fall back on other personality traits. And this is just kind of a statistical phenomenon. When you have a massive deviation from the population you're from, the other traits tend to sort of go down in what I call trait mountain. However, in the case of the antebellum freedmen, because the filter itself is not necessarily just filtering for IQ, we don't know for sure what exactly it's filtering, trait mountain probably did not exist with the antebellum freedmen, and that there were probably, in terms of all their personality traits across the board, not just IQ, they were probably about on par with whites. So what appears to have happened is that a population of blacks that was uncannily similar in their behavior to whites moved into northern cities. And guess what happened? They were treated like white people. Not right away. It took about a generation, fair enough, but there it was. And Thomas Sowell, throughout Black Rednecks and White Liberals, laments the Great Migration from the South that destroyed the situation where whites and blacks in northern cities actually were equal and actually did get along in due course. Because what is Thomas Sowell? Thomas Sowell is a black white person. He's a white person that just happens to be black. And he sees an aperture of history where all his hopes and dreams actually happened, where you had actual racial equality. And it wasn't some retard political movement blithering about equality and justice, but from genetic similarity and fair treatment in a meritocratic society. It was a time and place where the beliefs about race that white conservatives today have actually were true and actually did happen, where you had the talented 20th of blacks who pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and integrated and became part of white society. The old Republican dream made real. And as I said before, the bog standard oppression narratives we have today didn't exist back then. For example, high black criminality of recent black immigrants to Philadelphia, they wouldn't say, oh, the cops, they're just out to get the Negro. Because first off, they'd have to explain why the cops are unfairly targeting the postbellum freed blacks, when the cops obviously didn't target the antebellum freed blacks previously. And also because the whole meme about the police being particularly biased against blacks just hadn't been invented yet. And this also might be because there hadn't been much time since the blacks moved out of the South in the 1890s. So one could imagine that in time, these new blacks in Philadelphia would come to behave like the old ones did, which is to say, like white people. But start getting into the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and this is just not happening. So now, all the environmental determinists, they need new theories. Now, you and I sitting here, we have what is today some special knowledge. Not special because we're particularly smart, but just because we happen to know a single thing that makes explaining the world so much easier. That is race differences in intelligence and all the traits that ride with intelligence and their genetic component. These average racial differences being primarily genetic, around 80% for IQ and probably even higher for self-control and ability to plan ahead. And so it's this strange kabuki theater where we can very easily see and explain what's going on, but to have to sit back and watch as the wizards on the stage there try to explain a genetic phenomenon without reference to genes. It reminds me of cities that have used predictive policing algorithms, and what ends up happening is the algorithm just tells them to send cops into black and, to a lesser extent, Hispanic neighborhoods. And I went over this in a video I made a while ago called The Rise of the Racist Robots. So they forbid the algorithm to use race as a criteria, and so the algorithm ends up telling the police to go into areas that have a lot of menthol sales and have liquor stores with check cashing services. And so they end up just telling police to do the same thing as when they explicitly use race. The algorithm finds a way to racially profile even if you say you can't racially profile. They find the correlates and end up telling you to do the same thing. And that's kind of what sociologists do, trying to explain racial equality in everything when they forbid genetic explanations. Of course, their environmental explanations always fail, and so they're always changing. So we're sitting here at the theater watching this retard trying to figure out this problem, and we keep telling him it's the genes, stupid. And when we say that, he screams at us and calls us racist for saying that, asks us what our credentials are, and then comes up with four-dimensional hyperloop white privilege inferred from quantum entanglement, and his super fragile explanation will of course last for about 10 years until some new trend shows up and shatters it. Meanwhile, we're sitting here in the theater yelling at these bozos, it's the genes, stupid, don't you believe in evolution? The same explanation that explained what was going on in 1890 explains what's going on in 1990, and you're coming along with all these new exotic theories that get shattered over and over and over again because you just cannot bring yourself to believe in evolution and genes. All these perturbations and all these problems you're having to come up with, such complex theories to explain what can very simply and easily be explained by humans evolved in different places, and humans evolved adaptations to these different places. One of those adaptations was brain functions. And so they start off by saying that the great mass of black immigrants will just integrate just like the antebellum freedmen did. The postbellum freedmen will integrate just like the antebellum freedmen did. But then that doesn't happen. So then they move to the belief that, well, it's segregation and the Jim Crow laws and all the norms that are causing the poverty and the criminality of these blacks. Never did they imagine that they might have cause and effect reversed here, that segregation is really a form of quarantine and white people practicing civilizational self-defense, but never mind that for now. So we get the Civil Rights Act. And at the time, people who started pushing for racial quotas, what we call affirmative action, they believed that they would become unnecessary in about 10 years, 15 years at the most. And we've seen how that played out. But why wouldn't they think that? If segregation's the problem, and in addition to ending segregation, you're also giving racial quotas and privileges, well, damn if we don't make some serious progress towards this great thing we're supposed to want, which is racial equality. Well, we're 53 years on from that, and there's been virtually zero progress towards this goal we're supposed to have of racial equality. And our brilliant intellectuals, all of our wizards, have come up with these new and exotic forms of white privilege, implicit racism, how implicit bias perpetuates white supremacy, and the whole fucking word salad. And of course, our great intellectuals, they don't deny genetic differences between two individuals. No. Sure, some people, by dint of their genes, will be better at math than other individuals. That is something that is so experientially true that when trying to teach a new math concept to two people in the same classroom for the first time, that we have seen one person just gets it and the other person doesn't, and over and over again. One person gets it, the other person doesn't. And to deny this experienced visceral reality, it would just break all of your credulity and people would just stop listening to you. And of course, if you look at two groups of individuals, maybe people from the east side of the tracks versus the west side of the train tracks, there would be some genetic difference in average intellectual abilities between these two arbitrarily defined groups. Don't know exactly what it would be, but certainly there would be some difference, right? These great intellectuals, they have to accept that because this is obviously true. If you took two random groups of people, there would be some average intellectual difference. But as soon as the groups you're drawing lines around happen to correspond to the historical colloquial races, then stop. No, those must be the same. As soon as the groups you draw the lines around become the races or correspond with the races, then they're the same. Individual genetic differences? Sure. Arbitrarily defined group genetic differences? Sure. But if those arbitrarily defined groups correspond to the colloquial races, then they must be the same. And I say this, and it's really stupid what this is, what they do, how they think. And it's maddening for me to try to explain this to normal people, because these wizards who deny genetic differences between the races, they are so balls in your face stupid that literally the whole of social science in 90% of universities are literally as stupid as I'm describing here, that it's hard for the average Joe to believe it. It's so big, it's so balls in your face stupid that the average Joe just doesn't believe me. There's no way that these fucking wizards could be so dumb. Because it's so big, it's so many universities. I'm talking about Harvard, Yale, I'm talking big fucking names. And I'm saying it's this obviously stupid. They're making an error this obviously stupid for so long. And I say this and people just, it's too much. If this were true, someone would have called it out a long time ago. That's how the average person thinks. And I can't blame them for thinking that way. And what's also difficult is that when you're talking to a low IQ person, they like to use low IQ indicators to figure out what's true and false. This means, university tenure. This means credential. Who's the academic? Say I'm arguing with an academic. The arguments will eventually become technical. Now, never mind that the person I'm arguing with, his position is literally impossible once you accept freshman level genetics concepts. The fact is he can spin jargon, and I can respond to his spun jargon, and we're both saying things that the audience doesn't understand. And so the listener ends up just going with, well, I don't understand either of these guys, but one is a credentialed academic, the other is just some guy on the internet, so I'll go with the credentialed academic. Even though the people who actually study this particular topic on race differences and intelligence agree more with me than they do with the fucking wizards. okay? There's actually surveys on intelligence researchers. No, guess what? They agree with me, not with, the wizards of Lysenko. And that's also kind of why I've been trying to get some academics to openly support what I say, not because they necessarily have some great arguments to add, though sometimes they do, but primarily I need those funny hats. Right? I need to be able to say, look, we got a wizard hat here, and I can sort of, put on the wizard hat and say, look, I'm an academic now, all right? Or at least I'm endorsed by these particular academics. So I got the wizard hat, he got the wizard hat. So now can we move past funny hats and talk about the topic itself? And I've spent years going on about twin studies and inferring heritability and subtest heritability differences, looking at mixed populations and what is the most parsimonious explanation, going down into frickin' South American countries and looking at granular distributions of admixture, showing, very clear trends in mixed populations. And any honest observer will go through this ocean of evidence that we've been building up, and they will just say, yes, evolution happened in humans above the neck in the past 100,000 years. And there's regional differentiation. Right? There is, in fact, divergent evolution. Just as with skin color, just as with every other part of the body, there is also divergent evolution regarding the brain, and not just size and shape, which has been confirmed nowadays through MRI scans. Gould was wrong, Gould lied, right? There are differences in brain morphology today. And surprise, surprise, these differences in brain morphology seem to correspond to some differences in function, just as you would predict with literally any other animal being studied. And now we're actually finding within population validated gene correlates with intelligence that differ by population. And a while ago, and it's been a meme for so long, at least among me and my little group, that we would joke about idiots who think you have to find the genes to infer heritability. And that's really stupid, right? Because you would deny basically the heritability of any trait before we could ever find any gene for anything. And you would say, well, we have no idea if heredity even exists because you gotta always find the gene. And just how stupid that is. But we're at the door of literally being able to find the gene for population differences and individual differences in intelligence right now. And sure, they try to dismiss the work of David Piffer. They'll find some problems with the study, and guess what? Every study has problems, right? Finding some imperfection in a study doesn't. And I've argued about that and how Piffer's work is perfectly valid. But even if you forget all that, even if you say Piffer's full of crap, even if you say all the criticisms are sustained, any rebuttal of the criticisms are all bogus, even if Piffer is totally off base, boy, are these people missing the point. Piffer is just the first swing of the axe, buddy. There's a lot more swings coming, and this door is splintering apart. Even if Piffer didn't make the breakthrough, Piffer's just one guy. Piffer's just the first swing. And we're going to be in a situation where we've built a society on assumptions of racial equality, and then 20 years later, we'll have something like the 23andMe thing, except it tells you something like a genetic intelligence potential or genetic intelligence value, and we're going to be in a very strange situation where you have all of the wizards casting the spells of environmental determinism when we actually have uncovered the genes. And guess what? They're going to differ by population. There's no way they can't. There's no way they won't. And like with the genetic ancestry data, it's very much like that situation in a skit on Family Guy with Peter and Quagmire, where Peter kept saying something inane, and Quagmire just goes, you know what, I'm just going to move the conversation forward. And then Quagmire did. He talked about, what we should do based on X. When Peter kept on denying X, Quagmire just said, you know what, we're just going to go forward. X is true, let's talk about it now. Right. And that's kind of what happened with race denial and the 23andMe stuff. Pete, you had these goobers saying race doesn't exist because I don't know what categories are, and I like to say more variation within them between because I don't know what genetic drift or the difference between coding and non-coding sequences are, right? They'll just say these garbage race denial arguments. And then meanwhile, you had these companies that were kind of like Quagmire, where they just said, okay, buddy. Anyway, meanwhile, here's a genetic test that'll just tell you your race. Right. So I mean, it's over. Like we've moved the conversation forward. People who are denying race, they're like Peter in this skit, right? Okay, well, and anyway, companies like Ancestry.com and 23andMe, they've just skipped. They just said, yeah, we're moving the conversation forward. Here's how we're actually going to delineate the races here. And they might not say races, they'll say populations or whatever. Kind of like Neil Cavalli Sforza had a book called The Races of Man. It was published in the 1970s and later it was republished, but the publisher was saying, oh, you can't use race. And so he literally had it in a Word document and did a global word replace population with race. and he sent it in. It was literally just a global, like you would do on a Word document. That's literally all he did. All right, so anyways. So no doubt, even when you have the equivalent of a Ancestry.com test or 23andMe genetic test that gives you a genetic intelligence value, no doubt that even then you'll have the wizards come out and say, somehow that's not real. Somehow this doesn't say what it says. And just as people today don't deny biological race, that's kind of a non-starter. By the time we get to that point, the whole denial of a genetic intelligence value is just going to be a non-starter because there's just going to be a fucking app. We're just going to have an app that'll tell you this stuff, and people will use the app, and they won't need to use statistical arguments to viscerally experience the truth of it. They'll give somebody a genetic intelligence test, and it'll just be true. It'll say this guy's a 100 IQ person, this person's a 130 IQ person, and the difference will be overwhelming and immediate and obvious that this is true. They won't have to use statistical tables or charts or regressions or chi-squares or anything like that. They will experience it and it'll be true, and that'll be the end of this whole stupid thing. And all the people who deny race differences in intelligence, they're just going to be like Peter on that couch. But anyway, back to the myth of prejudice. We know that the United States has lost many of its cities. All these European countries, they like to chide the United States about how their cities are functional. Even places like Portland, Oregon, or Pittsburgh, that are still majority white for whatever reason, they're rated as some of the nicest cities to live in. And European countries will laugh at the United States. Why don't your cities work? Why don't you have nice mass transit? Or Japan will say, why don't your cities work? Why are you all spread out into suburban sprawl? And in the past, in the United States, you had the real city. And then you had the quarantined area where the blacks were. When the blacks moved into these northern cities, in order to keep the cities functional, these post-bellum blacks had to be quarantined. But in 1965, at the latest, and in some places it was even sooner, the quarantine was broken. And the civilizational self-defense of whites was made illegal. And blacks took over most of these cities. And these cities became as of Africa. And when someone blathers about oppression and racism, look, what happened in Detroit, what happened in St. Louis, what happened in the south side of Chicago, this is exactly what the segregationists said would happen. And this is what they were trying to prevent.
How many seeds are in a watermelon?
I know what you're thinking. Oh great, another Now This video where we get to listen to Jiminy Allensap destroy a libtard epic Ben Shapiro style with facts, logic, and evidence. Actually, no, not this time. This video from Now This accuses fair elections, one where people have to, prove who they are before they vote, as being an implement of white supremacy. Most YouTube commentators, including me oftentimes, would take this video and deconstruct it, proving why she's wrong with facts, logic, and evidence. Triggered libtard, but this time, let's skip the song and dance you've seen 1,000 times and hit on a deeper issue. What if she's actually right, but for the wrong reasons? To find out, we have to determine what she means when she says white supremacy, and why are those two words powerful enough to destroy someone's life or impugn a sitting congressman's reputation? I think most anti-SJW commentators and conservatives are actually missing the point when talking about so-called white supremacy. They approach the issue logically and correctly define white supremacy as the belief that whites are somehow superior to all others. They debunk the left's claims against that definition and call it a day. But that's missing the point. When the left talks about white supremacy, they are not talking about a belief. They conceptualize white privilege and white supremacy as ethereal systems that implicate every white person, that pervade every aspect of society. I'll explain what I mean in today's video. Steve King's recent trouble with the media, the article from last week about good parenting being white supremacy, the Covington Catholic controversy, and this woman's video, which we will reference, all have me thinking about these very basic questions. We see the accusation of white supremacy supremacy thrown around in the media like water balloons at a wet t-shirt party. When leftists say those two magic words, WS, are they actually talking about an ideology held by people that believe in the natural de facto superiority of the white race? Or is there an idea of white supremacy that includes every process, behavior standard, cultural norm, and custom found throughout Western civilization? Is the left correct when they accuse everything of being supremacist? But they're asking a fundamentally different question. They're using a fundamentally different definition. Today, I'll make the case why I believe that conservatives and the left are actually talking past each other on issues involving race, and neither group is truly understanding what the other is saying. But first, it's more fun than listening to yet another YouTube premium ad. You have the opportunity to own a piece of American history. People may not realize that humble, unassuming silver coins like these played a huge role in our country's development. Over 100 years ago, Morgan silver dollars were used to pay for and buy just about everything. Banknotes were for the very rich. Most people used these as $20 bills. Everybody from the president to the working class had these in their pocket. They're much heavier than you would expect if you've never held one before. And that's because they are 90% solid silver, guaranteed by the US Mint, so these coins are even eligible for your IRA or 401k rollover based on their purity. And take a look at the design here, original and classic. The credit goes to George Morgan, the engraver who created this gem. If you're curious and want to learn more, or you're thinking of starting to collect these, you can visit the website at historicsilvercoins.com, where you'll find loads more information, prices, and a great video about the history behind these coins. Plus, save $5 per coin by using the code JAMES today. Go to historicsilvercoins.com and save $5 per coin by using my promo code JAMES. Check it out today. Yes, I'll admit I have gotten into reading again, so maybe that's why I'm coming in with these galaxy-brained centrist style takes. Let's focus on two common takes that I often see regarding the accusation of white supremacy. First, the leftist take that you are all familiar with. The left argues that systems in America and the West, political systems like the Electoral College, the criminal justice system, TV and movie casting, the education system, the nuclear family, and even the standards we use when communicating with each other, all of these are examples of white supremacy. And if they aren't directly promoting it, they certainly are reinforcing it. To the activist and academic left, supremacy is omnipresent. It is weaved into every facet of American life. The conservative sees these arguments and attempts to own the libs with facts and logic. Quote, how can America be a white supremacist country if Indians and Jewish Americans have higher salaries than whites? Or how can we be supremacist if affirmative action grants better opportunities to Hispanic and black students? Or there are plenty of black TV shows and no one accuses them of black supremacy, etc. All of these are true statements and make good arguments for demonstrating that white people are by no means superior in today's society. We don't hold the upper hand, and we don't have privilege. We are not oppressing anyone. But the mistake that conservatives make is taking the term white supremacy at face value. You hear those two words, and you mentally immediately make the connection to a cross-burning Klansman, or red-laced Doc Martens and a freshly shaven head. Not with a Gillette razor, most likely. This is missing the point. When the left talks about white supremacy, they are not talking about systems that actively and explicitly promote white people over non-whites. Those systems don't exist anymore, and the people that believe in the inherent superiority of the white race are few and far between. So clearly that's not what they're talking about. They are talking about anything, concept, cultural standard, or ideal that was designed by a white person in a Western country. It's more than just incredulous cries of everything is white supremacy. If you interpret those two magic words the way the left does, you too would believe that white supremacy is baked into the American and Western cake. As leftist media elite Stephen Kantrowitz writes on BostonReview.net, quote, white supremacy connotes many grim and terrifying things, including inequality, exclusion, injustice, and state and vigilante violence. Like whiteness itself, white supremacy arose from the world of Atlantic slavery, but survived its demise. Yet, while the structures are old, the term white supremacy is not. This is part of what I mean when I say that conservatives and the left are talking past each other. When conservatives talk about, quote, white supremacy, they are referring to systems that proactively help whites and discriminate against minorities. As I already mentioned, those systems no longer exist. When the left is talking about white supremacy, they are referring to the very foundations of Western civilization. The Now This video I teased at the beginning is a perfect example. The woman from whatever the heck Institute for Fake Activism and Money Laundering tries to make the case that voter ID is just another example of white supremacy. Take a look.
So can you imagine in 1878, you're a sharecropper, you get to the voting booth, and you're ready to cast your vote, and the first thing that they ask you is how many seeds are in a watermelon? Of course, the person asking you the question doesn't know the answer, but it's a tactic, it's a quote-unquote literacy test. In other words, it's a bunch of crap. And most black people, all black people, were kept from voting because no one can answer the question, how many stars in the sky? Who knows how many stars in the sky?
This year, more than 200 years into Georgia's democratic experiment, the state failed its voters.
When I think about Georgia and the voter suppression that we saw in the most recent election between Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp, I immediately thought about what black folks had to go through down south. Like the idea of Brian Kemp stripping 300,000 names from the voter polls, that's nothing new. That is literally straight out of Mississippi voting rights oppression. And it's crazy to me. He didn't remix it. He didn't change it. He was just like, oh, it worked then. Let me try it now. He took 300,000 names out of the polls, and Stacey Abrams only lost by 55,000 votes.
I'll admit, the urge to just roast her for being clearly out of her depth is pretty strong. Where did they find this lady anyways? Lady parts justice? There truly is no respite from clown world if this lady is considered a democracy expert. Her claim that the video editors have to help her stumble through is that voter suppression is white supremacy. Voter suppression is the scary way of saying having a fair election where you don't allow dead people to vote. The 300,000 people removed from the voter rolls, or voter polls if you're this woman, were people who had not voted in 2 elections and had not responded to repeated inquiries from the state government about whether they wanted to remain registered voters. They didn't vote in 2 elections, that's at least 4 years, and then didn't respond when asked if they still live in state, were still alive, or still planned on voting. They had the ability to re-register to vote at any time, but they chose not to. Many of those 300,000 were dead or had moved out of state. The others, well, do you really want someone so disengaged that they haven't voted in 4 years and cannot even bother to re-register voting in your elections? Not really. Beyond that, leaving old and inaccurate voter information on the rolls is a huge election security risk. The state of Georgia allows voters to request absentee ballots online or via mail, meaning you don't have to show ID. There is always a risk of voter fraud, but common sense policies like regularly purging inactive voter registrations is a great way to cut down on potential fraud and protect the sanctity of the vote. Take a look at Europe and you'll find election security procedures much stricter than those in most US states. France, Iceland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and Northern Ireland all require voter ID to cast a ballot. In Germany, polling notifications are mailed to eligible voters, and voters are then asked to show photo ID when they go to vote, although not always. Argentina and Brazil, both former European colonies with relatively large white populations, require voter ID, or in Brazil's case, biometric data as well. Point being that Western countries, those built by Europeans and those of European descent, tend to have strict rules about election fairness and election sanctity. When Western countries hold elections, we want them to be fair. This was true in ancient Rome, the birthplace of small r republican government, and it remains true today. Fair elections are the standard in Western nations that hold them, and as far as civilizations go, that is unique. Even Japan, which is better than the US in several areas, has a voter registration fraud problem. In India, superpower by 2020, right? Cash for vote scandals have rocked parliament in 2008 and in 2015. However, the problems in India and Japan pale in comparison to the problems found in Africa and Central America. Everyone understands that most African elections are essentially one step removed from civil war. For example, in Sudan's 2010 election, here is just a flavor, just a taste of what the country experienced. School children casting votes, soldiers casting multiple ballots, election officials using chemicals to remove the ink from people's fingers meant to prevent repeated voting. An excellent foolproof system, no doubt, and widespread reports of stuffed and stolen ballot boxes. In Nigeria, 78% of respondents to a study said that it was not immoral to sell your vote in exchange for money. Just this week in the Congo, massive electoral fraud was revealed, to the point where international authorities are getting involved to try to bring order to the election process. Pick any African country you want, type in that country's name, plus voter fraud or election fraud on a search engine of your choice, and settle in for hours and hours of stories. Voter ID, mailing out polling cards, forget it. They're literally using stamp pads and finger ink in Africa. Fair elections are not a part of the African tradition, nor are they an integral part of the Latin American tradition. Mexico 2006, Honduras 2017 and 2013, Venezuela 2013, and on and on and on. In Honduras in 2009, a sterling example of Central American election integrity, several people simply disappeared before the election after the army requested lists of enemigos of the electoral process so that they could be, and I quote, neutralized. The list goes on and on. You get the idea by now. Well, what does all of this have to do with so-called white supremacy? Fair elections are an integral part of Western civilization. Western civilization was built by European people, and so, when Americans want to enforce fair election rules in the United States, that is, by the terms of the left, white supremacy. Mythology has been used by peoples throughout history to explain the world around them. White supremacy, for today's anti-white left, has become a fundamental myth. They see Western civilization, because of its origins in Europe, as an inherently white supremacist system, and they see white people as beneficiaries of that supremacist system. Free speech is another area where you see evidence of this concept. Western civilization has long valued the idea that people may speak their minds freely, expressing their ideas and beliefs. This concept is attacked by the left as being inherently white supremacist. Activists, many of them racial minorities, will be in the streets demanding that conservative or right-wing speech be censored, and it is not at all uncommon to see violence be committed against people with whom the left disagrees. Is there a sociological precedent for this? Well, possibly. Free speech is celebrated throughout the West, but the same is not true for much of Central America and Africa. In many foreign cultures, might makes right. The idea that political or ideological minorities should be protected is completely foreign in cultures where you can be killed for being disrespectful. We see this bear out in polling of American minorities regarding free speech, where disproportionate amounts of American minorities, Hispanics and blacks, believe that people who are, quote, disrespectful should have their right to speak freely taken away. As our good friend Noah Berlatsky writes over at CNN, people he determines to be Nazis should have their free speech censored because it hurts others' feelings. They see Western civilization's long-standing protection of free political speech as inherently white supremacist. Another great example is the case of the boys from Covington Catholic. They were viciously attacked, threatened, and intimidated by members of the national media. They, their parents, and their classmates were accused of being complicit in white supremacy. Did the boys ever claim that the white race is superior? No. Did they indicate that they believe white people should rule over all others? No, not even close. They dared to stand and smile in the face of a Native American that was targeting them for intimidation because they were white kids wearing Trump hats. According to the neoliberal morality of the day, in this case, they were supposed to cower. They were supposed to run away and apologize. But they didn't. They refused. They were not aggressive at all, but they refused to display any degree of white guilt, and that is why they're being targeted. The base level take here is that the left sees white supremacy in all conservative politics. That's true. Just look at tweets like this from verified blue-check Twitter users that elucidate this philosophy. Their beliefs go deeper, though. They don't just see all conservatives as being part of a white supremacist system. They see all white people as being guilty. Whiteness is the original sin, and everyone is born guilty. This is why they will vehemently attack not only the MAGA hat kids, but their parents and their families as well. It's why elites like Noah Berlatsky and Margaret Hagerman accuse white people that send their children to private school or read to their kids as being complicit in racist white supremacy. It's why every attack on these kids focused not on what they were doing, but who they are. They were attacked for who they are, their gender, their religion, but most importantly, their whiteness. The phrase white supremacy is used because of how indefensible it is. Nobody's going to stand up and say, I defend white supremacy. Nobody's going to do that, and the left knows. That's why they use that term. They're being extremely deceitful. What they attack as white supremacy isn't actually the idea that whites are superior. They are attacking white people for the crime of being white. This is what conservatives miss. They take leftist claims at face value and try to factually debunk claims of white supremacy. And that's missing the point. These claims of white supremacy are not being made in good faith. They're being made purely to attack white people, white societies, white countries, and Western civilization as a whole. Any behavioral standard, cultural norm, or legal tradition in a Western country will be attacked as upholding supremacy. Just you watch. They're rolling this out and using it to attack just about everything. The supremacy charge is being used precisely because of how scary it sounds. They know that it triggers your moral sensibilities, that it causes flashbacks to Hollywood villains, etc. And they're using that reaction to attack, undermine, and subvert Western values, traditions, and people. And they think they can get away with it. They think that people will be so scared of being called a white supremacist that they will not fight back politically as their culture is being destroyed in front of them. People need to realize that these phrases are just scare words and nothing more. Accusations of racism, supremacy, and the like don't actually have any meaning. They are simply being made with the attempt to scare and stigmatize. They don't want to debate the facts and logic. They want you to be scared of the media. They want you to be scared to push back against them. Once you recognize that these accusations are being made in bad faith, it will free you from feeling like you have to debunk and disprove them with facts and logic and evidence. And just like any other myth, you can dismiss it as a fiction that it is.
Look, I was saying to now, this whole fallacy about the colonials assuming that if they had never come to Africa
case, but it was by stepping back and looking at the big picture and going, probably not. And when you step back, look at the trajectories of these countries, we can then say that the colonial oppression narrative, probably not. Africa is probably just full of people genetically similar to those who live in Detroit and Baltimore and Haiti, and the results are what you would predict from that. The U.S. federal government, state, and local governments do not collect data on race and tax revenue. So the data I'm going to be presenting here is based on multiple sources to come up with an estimate of net fiscal impact of races in the United States. The overall spending and revenue data includes state, federal, and local tax revenue and spending from 2018. All data here is from 2018 unless otherwise stated. So first, I will present what I define as the best estimate straight away, and then I will explain how I got to these numbers. Table on the screen. So first you can see whites, net fiscal effect are plus 312 billion, blacks minus 660.7 billion, Hispanics minus 334 billion, and Asians, which are a heterogeneous group, 292.97 billion positive. In addition, if you took the white U.S. population and assigned to them the entire military budget, they would still run a small surplus. And you can see that on a table here, with whites still running a surplus of 56.4 billion, even with all military assigned to them. And this is a striking fact. Whites in the U.S. would be just barely running budget surpluses even if all of the current military spending in absolute terms of the current U.S. federal government is assigned to whites. And as you will see, this takes into account the high Medicare and Social Security use of whites as well. So, how did I come to this? Well, we don't have direct data on tax revenue by race from the federal government. However, there are private organizations that calculate tax revenue by income brackets, and you can see that here. And we also have government data on race and income bracket by roughly these brackets. They don't have the top 1%, but we can look at the top 5% distribution by race. So with these two pieces of data, wonderful. With this, we can estimate how much each race pays in taxes based on their percentages within each income bracket. And so here we have the total revenue estimated based on non-interpolated, I'll get into that, income bracket placement by race. Now you may be looking at this and go, wait a minute, aren't these numbers different than the ones I presented above? They're a little bit different, but they're pretty close, but yes, they are. And that's because this data isn't interpolated. The problem here is that if you look at the income distribution, bracket distribution by race, these are very large chunks. And we get the average proportions within each bracket, but we don't see the effects of, say, at the 1 percentile, the 86 percentile, etc. And so what a linear interpolation does is just filling in the gaps between the known and unknown data. And so here's a visual of the gaps between income bracket proportions. And so looking at that graph, it's almost certain that whites within each bracket, for example, have higher incomes than the blacks within the same brackets. This is because the black trend line is further down than the white one, and so unless there is some radical deviation from linearity, this downtrend will also exist within each of these brackets, not just between them. And so whites within each bracket will be paying more taxes than blacks within each bracket. And so the linearly interpolated data looks like this. So by doing this, we get much more granulated estimates. And again, so as long as there's not a radical deviation from linearity between these points, this will give us a more accurate idea of tax revenue in the US. And so by this method of a linear interpolation, the racial disparities in income tax revenue are increased somewhat, as you can see here. And there's also an article linked in the description where you can just compare the tables at your leisure. And these results were smaller than I expected. Now, from here on, I'm just going to be using the interpolated revenue estimates, but as you'll see, the main conclusions and the big picture don't change very much. Now, somebody might be asking, why are you using these income ranges? I just saw data breaking down the top 1% and the preceding 4%. Why don't you include that breakdown before interpolating? And again, the reason for this is that I don't have racial distributions in income down to the 1 percentile, or at least I have not been able to find any. So there we have revenue. Next, we should look at government consumption. In 2018, whites were 60.4% of the population, but actually consumed 61.06% of all government. So this is higher consumption, and this higher consumption of whites was driven entirely by Social Security and Medicare payments. So whites actually use slightly more government than their proportion. You could remove Social Security, both the taxes and the revenue, from this equation, but since whites pay a similarly proportionate share of Social Security taxes, the effects of doing this are going to be negligible. And the reality is that Social Security is a form of welfare anyway. It's just paid for by taxes. The trust fund is bankrupt, it's reliant on tax revenues, so it is functionally just another tax and spend welfare program, regardless of what some politicians in the past said it would be. It doesn't matter how you sort of define it or draw boxes around things. At the end of the day, people pay taxes. Social Security is just another tax. And then money goes back. Money goes back in the form of Medicare, Medicaid, income security, unemployment benefits, and Social Security. In addition, things like roads, defense, administration, the DMV, all of this I assume to be equally used by members of each race. Now, the government functions I identified as variable government, that they would likely vary between the races, are these: law courts, police, prisons, public transit, welfare, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And these are the budgets of the government services and their usage by race, sources in the description. How I came to the conclusion of usage by race. For law courts, police, and prisons, that was fairly simple. I just looked at the prison population. Because to go to prison, you're getting arrested by a cop, and you're going through a court. And there may be some differential between individuals, how much court they use, how much police has to be used to send them to prison. But over millions of people, I assume it just washes out between the races, and we can just use the prison population as a proxy for how much each race is using the law courts, police, and prisons. Now, usage of cops, courts, and prisons by blacks may be seen as unfair because it's not necessarily a real service to blacks. However, this video is not about actual benefits to groups. It's about the fiscal impact of groups. And kind of like with education, the brute fact is that blacks are costing more money by overloading these government agencies, fairly or unfairly, whether they want to or not. That's a discussion for another time. This is simply about the brute financial costs. And so we can convert these percentile numbers into absolute numbers based on the budgets of each of these items. And you can see that here. And with this data, we can come up with assignment of government usage by race based on variable and then what I call equal government. And so here we have the fiscal impact with variable government and equal government breakdowns. And so from this, we see that whites, despite constituting 60.4% of the population, make up 62% of variable government spending. And again, this is driven by Social Security and to a lesser extent by Medicare. The Social Security numbers also take into account SSI payments, which whites take proportionately less of. And this dampens how much whites overuse Social Security a little bit compared to other races. Whites use Social Security at a higher rate, and they also have more benefits per person. But SSI transfers almost exactly offset the higher Social Security payout per person that whites use, and the result being that the total amount of money each race gets corresponds almost exactly with just the number receiving benefits. I don't know if this is just some giant coincidence or if this was by design. And so with all these pieces in place, we can finally look at the fiscal effects of each group. And this is the fiscal impact of racial groups in the United States. This is the table I showed at the beginning, but I'll show it again. However, say blacks, Hispanics, and Asians, who are substantial contributors to the budget deficits or help reduce the budget deficit, as in the case of Asians, say they didn't exist in the US, that the US was just white people. Well, first off, the amount of income earned by whites in the US would probably be about the same. This is based on there being no relation to the percentage of non-whites in a state and the income of the whites in that state after adjusting for cost of living. And so we can look at white median real income in 2017. Again, this is from 2017 because it's the most recent data I could find, not 2018, by state and percentage white. And at least in 2017, there was no relation. Now, just as an aside, an all-white U.S. would be a more rural U.S., and this is sort of my justification of the cost of living adjustment here. So while the nominal GDP of this country would be right at about 14 trillion, the real GDP would be about 14.7 trillion in terms of what those dollars could purchase versus what current U.S. dollars could purchase, which is to say it's about 5% more, i.e. the dollar would be stronger because white people get more for their dollar because white people more often live in rural areas. And so if blacks, Hispanics, and Asians didn't exist in the US, the dollar would be stronger, which isn't necessarily a good or bad thing in and of itself. Right, there are costs and benefits to a strong or weak currency. And while this is irrelevant to current fiscal impact, since federal budgets are done on purely nominal terms, right, you pay taxes based on how many dollars you earn and other factors, regardless of how much you can get with those dollars. Now, an all-white U.S. would be a rural shift, which means real GDP, purchasing power parity, would only decline by about 26.5%. Not 30%, even though nominal GDP would decline 30%. And that is why it is justified to use the cost of living adjustments when looking at the effects of non-whites on white income. Before doing this, I was worried that there may be some relation between the presence of blacks and Hispanics and higher white incomes due to urbanites having higher incomes. This is also true in 90+% white cities in Europe as well. Like the whites in the cities make more than the whites in the countryside in cities that are almost entirely white anyway. And so I was worried that I have to point out that we don't know if it's causal because it could just be the effects of urban incomes. But luckily, there is no relation, thank goodness, and so this isn't even an issue that we have to deal with. So, but the point is that there is no boost to white incomes by the presence of blacks and Hispanics, or as far as we know, Asians. Some white people gain from having, cheap labor, some lose, but on balance the effect is nil, which means it is appropriate to simply add and subtract the fiscal impact of these groups in sort of a hypothetical. Of course, in the real world, if all Hispanics, blacks, and Asians were just instantly, disappeared from the current US, there would be enormous economic problems because the economy would have all these holes constituting about 40% of the labor force. I'm simply saying that this is approximately what the US economy would be like if those people were never in the US at all and the economy developed with just white people. It would be smaller, but wealthier per person. Real estate would be about 30% cheaper, right? Given that 30% of the purchasing power has been disappeared, but there's still just as much land, and so land would presumably be that much cheaper, 30% cheaper, and rent would presumably also be roughly 30% less. It would be much less crowded, working class wages would be higher, and the wealthiest wouldn't be as wealthy due to not having as much cheap labor. Wage labor, the working class would be in a better bargaining position because there's less of them, because whites have a higher capital to labor ratio than blacks or Hispanics. The US, in short, the US would look a lot more like Denmark. So let's look at the budget of white America. I don't for a moment believe white America would spend less on military in absolute terms than it does today, since all racial groups in the US about equally favor the military spending, right? Militarism in the US is a pan-racial attitude. So would white America still run a balanced budget even if military spending was maintained at the same absolute level, not the same relative level, the same absolute level? It's about 800 something billion. And the answer is yes. Put in the current military budget as it stands. Everything else was reduced proportionately to the white population for the equal government, and the variable government was reduced as defined previously. But just keeping the military, not reducing it at all, whites would still be running a budget surplus. But there's even more to this. In 2018, interest payments on the national debt were $433.7 billion. If blacks and Hispanics didn't exist in the US, say starting in 1950, based on current information, there would be a smaller national debt and thus lower interests today. Obviously, some of that debt was a function of World War I, World War II, and the New Deal, so it's not like there would be no national debt in white America. But it would be less to some degree that I haven't quantified. Just as an experiment, because a lot of people may have problems with my interpolation thing or my breakdown of government usage, let's see how much these results, with all the work I did and all the breakdowns I did, how much they differ from a much simpler method of just assuming equal government for everything, no breakdowns for welfare or public service or Social Security, and just assume each race uses government at the same rate, and then use the non-interpolated data on tax revenue. Don't make any assumptions about what's between the bars, just, weight the bars in kind of a dumb Grug line. So this is what I call the Grug analysis that assumes equal government and non-interpolated revenue. And the results are fairly similar. Hispanics come out looking, a bit worse, and whites and Asians come out looking quite a bit worse. And whites come out looking a little bit worse. Blacks come out looking a little bit better. So all of my deeper analysis actually doesn't yield results meaningfully different from just using non-interpolated tax revenue and then just assuming equal government usage for everyone. So it's telling that even with this debt that was, in part, accrued by deficits caused by blacks and Hispanics, white America would still be running a budget surplus while not cutting the military 1 cent. And while Asians substantially contribute to the budget, they are not necessary for balanced budgets. Whites can do that on their own. Even with whites' bloated military budget, even with bloated white usage of Social Security benefits and Medicare, even with all that taken into account, whites still, for all their foibles, would be running a surplus. So to all the conservative deficit hawks who say we need to run balanced budgets, well, I have news for you. We already are. We, as in white people, already are. The entire budget deficit, along with some proportion of the national debt itself, is a function of black and Hispanic populations. The net effect of these two populations, even after taking away all military spending assigned to them, costs the U.S. $822.5 billion per year. Keep in mind that some proportion of black and Hispanic incomes itself comes from blacks and Hispanics in the military. So more of these people means this number goes up. It is very expensive to have these people in your country, and countries made up entirely or almost entirely of these people have constant financial problems. Discussions about Hispanic countries center around debt, currency devaluations, the IMF, and African countries also center around those same things, but they also have, in addition, African countries have lots of discussions about foreign aid and emergency relief, the same kinds of discussions that you have with blacks in the US. Okay, that's what countries made up entirely of these people look like. And it doesn't matter if their constitution is virtually a carbon copy of the United States's, as in the case of Liberia. It doesn't matter. Or if they went to US schools, or if they're in France or the UK. Okay, for example, blacks have similar fiscal impacts in France and the UK as well. Whenever you interact with these people, within a country or internationally, it's going to cost you lots and lots of money. It's going to cost you trillions. And while I'm one of those horrible people who thinks these differences are down to genes, right? That's the most parsimonious explanation for these things transcending time and space. All throughout history this was true, and in all countries this is true. Fine, you don't want to believe that. Okay, well, practically speaking, it's still irrelevant because it has proven to be unchangeable. We have not been able to change this fact thus far. And this is why immigration needs to be stopped. Not legal, illegal, any of that stuff. But immigration, period, needs to be stopped. Or at least this is just one of the reasons. Immigration needs to be stopped. And that reason is the economic health of the United States, if you care.
Hello, I'm Jared Taylor. There are a lot of powerful people who don't want anyone to see my videos. So if you end up liking what you see, I'd appreciate it if you'd send a link to some of your friends. We've had a rash of fake black people, white women who've decided they'd rather be black. The latest is Jennifer Benton. 10 years ago, when she started passing herself off as black, she legally changed her name to Satchel Pagelin Cole, after Satchel Paige, the black ball player. Her high point as a black woman came in 2017 when she became the spokesman for the family of a black man killed by an Indianapolis cop. Until it was discovered she's white, she was the vice president of an organization called Don't Sleep. It's all about being black, so she had to go. Here, Satchel Pagelin explains her theories about policing.
If you are one of the lawmakers or one of the people that are tasked with reducing that violence, then you are looking at punishment. And I've said for a long time, people don't need punishment. We don't need punitive measures. We need restorative justice. People often will only live up to what you tell them they are. So when our answer to violence is to just put more police in, you just keep reassuring people that they really are violent.
Ms. Cole was also an LGBTQ activist and insists that she be referred to as they, not her, as in they were a grand marshal in the Indianapolis Pride Parade this year. I don't know if she was faking the LGBTQ stuff too. When she was outed, she fessed up. I have taken up space as a black person while knowing I am white. Are black people running out of space? She also said, my deception and lies have hurt those I care most about. Since she cares most about black people, it must be very sad to be kicked out. In the meantime, Indianapolis will be engaged in healing. Another fraud this month was C.V. Vitolo Haddad. She was a doctoral student and teaching assistant at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Turns out she is Southern Italian, so the Haddad business may be just for show. She too is a they, not a her, and this is what they are like.
The core takeaway is that the right uses science as a way to explain away structural phenomenon, like centuries of discrimination that have decimated black wealth in America and made equal opportunity as much of a pipe dream as equal outcome. Talent is evenly distributed across all of humanity, but it's tamped down during childhood and bad education and squandered in non-compete clauses.
She was co-president of the Teaching Assistants Association at Madison, and she had just been offered a tenure-track job at Cal State Fresno. Cal State won't touch her now, although it said in a statement, the university will always uphold its core values of discovery, diversity, and distinction. I think a fake black would be great for discovery and diversity. The Teaching Assistants Association said it was profoundly sorry for the harm it caused, adding that the association is infused with white supremacy and anti-blackness. The leaders will take anti-racism training and work towards healing as a group, more healing. Perhaps the most high-profile phony this month was Jessica Krug, a tenured professor at George Washington University in D.C. She was actually a Jew from Kansas who graduated from a fancy private school, but later claimed that she was an unrepentant and unreformed child of the hood, that her parents were drug addicts, and that her mother was a prostitute. She skipped her mother's funeral in 2013 for fear she might give the game away. Professor Krug couldn't decide if she was Algerian or Caribbean or black Boricua, whatever that is, and people got suspicious. When she came clean, she said that she was the very epitome of violence, of thievery, and appropriation. She has resigned from her professorship and says, "You should absolutely cancel me." George Washington University sent email to all students saying, "We hope that with this update, our community can begin to heal." More healing. The message encouraged people who needed it to get help from campus mental health services. In 2018, Miss Krug had published a book about fugitive slaves. Now, everyone is saying it's no good. But last year, it was a finalist for 2 top awards, the Harriet Tubman Prize and the Frederick Douglass Book Prize. Here's what she's like under one of her nicknames, Jess La Bombadera.
Hey, I'm Jess La Bombadera. I'm here in El Barrio, East Harlem. You probably know this neighborhood because the Hosanna Melissa Mark Viverito, who used to be the speaker of your city council, sold my fucking neighborhood to developers and gentrifiers. So I got a couple of things to say. And when y'all come on and tell me my time stops, fuck out of here. I also want to call out all these white New Yorkers who waited 4 hours with us to be able to speak and then did not yield their time to Black and brown indigenous New Yorkers. The NYPD is a colonial occupation force. Let's be real honest. Y'all know they're being trained by the IDF. They are trained in counterinsurgency methods. It is not a surprise or shock that they are using counterinsurgency methods against us in the Bronx, Black and brown people.
Yes, she had tenure at a major university. These 3 aren't the first phonies. In the 1990s, Elizabeth Warren claimed to be a Cherokee when she was teaching at Penn and Harvard. In 1984, she contributed to a collection of allegedly Indian recipes called Pow Wow Chow. Her crab meat recipes were presumably passed down lovingly from generation to generation, except she copied them right out of the New York Daily News. And then there was Rachel Dolezal. She's about as white as you can get with blue eyes and blonde hair. She is from Montana and, weirdly, claimed that she was born and reared in a teepee, and her parents hunted their food with bow and arrow. Around 2011, she started darkening her skin and kinking her hair, and teaching college courses on the Black woman's struggle and African history. In 2014, she was elected president of the Spokane NAACP and appointed chairman of the Spokane Police Ombudsman Commission. Her career as a Black woman was really taken off. But then the truth came out. She then legally changed her name to Nkechi Diallo, and she still says she identifies as Black. She was married to a Black man for a while and has a mixed-race baby, but now she says she's bisexual. I don't think she's a they, though. There is a Netflix documentary all about her. So what are these women going to do now? Apparently, Rachel Dolezal is getting by as a hairdresser under her new name. But there are no jobs for white people who have been demoted from being Black. It sounds like these ladies are confused. But I understand why they wanted to be Black. It gives them a better chance than being homely, unremarkable white women. Black privilege beats white privilege any day. And there are great psychological benefits. White people are the villains of history, while Black people are heroes. White people prop up white supremacy. Black people fight for justice. Who wouldn't rather be Black? They gave up nothing. They became twofer diversity stars. They became morally superior. And it's so much fun berating white people the way Jessica Krug did. No one doubts their support for the cause. They weren't spies trying to wreck the movement. But Blacks are furious. Lisa Betty at Fordham says that Miss Krug took up space, opportunity, time, and money. I call for reparations. Right, reparations. An Indianapolis activist says that because of Satchel Pageley, the community must repair the damage she has done. No one likes to be fooled, but what damage did she do? She worked hard for black people. It sounds like these people just don't want a white woman cashing in on their racket. And what does all this say about the idea that race isn't biology, but a social construct? These women were disgraced because they were biologically white. Rachel Dolezal still says that challenging the construct of race is at the core of evolving human consciousness. Shouldn't she be a hero? She proved with her very life that race is a social construct. We have to call these women they because sex is a social construct, right? If tomorrow I tell you I'm a woman, you have to say, yes, dear, and treat me like one. So why can't I claim to be a black woman? But these people reportedly sickened whole communities that have to heal. Heal from what? If a prof at George Washington were fired because he faked military service or plagiarized his thesis, would the students take sick and have to heal? If a prof everyone thought was white turned out to be a light-skinned black who was passing, would students need therapy? No. But no one would try to pass as white. No one would give up the advantages of being black. So let's summarize. White people are supposed to be swilling in privilege, but some find it's better to be oppressed. Race is supposed to be a social construct, nothing to do with biology. But if a white lady tries to prove it, she's a plague on the community. We're supposed to be living in a white supremacist country, but if you put up a sign on campus that says it's okay to be white, you're likely to be expelled. Are you confused? No, you're not confused. The country is. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to this video channel. Also, you might take a look at our website, amren.com, AMREN.com. We have videos, podcasts, articles, I think a lot of things that you'll find interesting. Again, thanks for watching.
Did you know the Nigerians govern a sector of space occupied by several different humanoid species?
If we say yes, will you feed us?
One of those species is the Benkarans. They occupy just 10% of Nigerian space, but take up nearly 80% of the space in Nigerian prisons.
Maybe they commit more crimes.
So we're seeing a large amount of black mob violence. If that sounds rough, well, look at the videos. Are these not in fact mobs? Well, they look like mobs to me. If this is not a mob, I don't know what you would call a mob. Okay, are they black? Well, they look mostly black to me. I know there's kind of a psyop going on, say, oh, it's white people who did this somehow. I don't know how on earth they're trying to pull that off. Okay, are they violent? Well, they look violent to me. Okay, violent black mobs, true. There's nothing incorrect in pointing that out. What triggered these riots? Well, a news event. Okay, what is news? What is news? Is it anything that I say? Is it anything that your friend says? Is it, some people may say in the colloquial sense, oh, that's news to me. But when we say news with a capital N, we're really talking about something that is said by specific organizations that are promoted by the government, promoted by universities, promoted by NGOs, and treated as authoritative by these institutions. And that's part of promotion, is treating as authoritarian. And you know who I'm talking about. CNN, NBC, Fox, ABC, New York Times, Washington Times, Washington Post, LA Times, the usual suspects. So we know what capital N news is. They're sort of like text and video blog platforms, and they give jobs to people with journalism majors from certain universities that control the supply of the journalism majors that go into these places. These journalism majors who write these stories, and they give their ice cold takes in front of cameras, they're easy to control because they, with a very few exceptions, can't get an audience on their own. And that's perfect. That makes them easy to control because they're sort of locked into their career as a journalism major working for CNN, for example. And these groups, these sort of text and video blog groups like CNN, they have been elevated by other institutions. And I don't know if there's some grand conspiracy about this, but the effect is that they control what the public is thinking about. That's the effect. Whether it's planned, whether it just sort of happened, whether it's emergent, doesn't matter. The effect is that they operate to control what the public is thinking about and what facts they know. In early YouTube, I've been around long enough to know about the pre-Google YouTube. The CNN channel, the New York Times channel, they couldn't draw flies to poop. Nobody cared about what they had to say about anything. Only later, when YouTube and Google became publishers and started to elevate these, what I'm going to call the highly controlled blog and video groups like CNN, then they got people to see it and start taking them seriously again. Otherwise, if not for Google and the real power structure promoting these blog and video groups, you just watch independent journalists dumping raw feeds, and there'd be nobody to tell you how to feel about anything or select which facts you're supposed to know. It'd just be sort of a random mishmash of stuff that people happen to record as they're walking around, sort of citizen journalists. Now, this is the context in which people like Mike Cernovich or Mitt Romney are speaking. They're speaking on the topics which this sort of controlled media tells them that they should care about. Now, in 2019, there were 370 whites who were shot to death by police, 235 blacks, 158 Hispanics, 39 other, and 202 of unknown race who were shot and killed by police. This averages to about 2.75 per day, so, you know, if all these are treated equally, you should be hearing about 2 to 3 police shootings per day, and a few other deaths by other methods. Most of it's done by shootings. That's how police actually kill people. But, you know, in this case of George Floyd, that's actually not a shooting. But most of the time it's a shooting. But you're not hearing about them. You hear about selected instances which are selected for you to tell you what to care about and how to feel about it. This is also sort of why it's basically impossible that this is some sort of revolutionary action against the system, right? When the system, quote unquote, is telling you precisely to care about this. And they're telling the police to stand down and let you destroy, you know, people's lives in destroying their businesses and destroying their livelihoods and stuff. Target will be fine. They have insurance. They're a big corporation. They'll be, and even if that fails, they'll be bailed out by Congress. So, you know, going after Target or going after Walmart or anything is not going to have any effect because they're part of this. They're part of the system and they'll be protected. The people you're destroying are the small businesses, right? Would you have heard about Floyd George or George Floyd if it wasn't on the news, quote unquote, on the news? Of course not. An event you otherwise never would have heard about becomes elevated and then made important. And CNN, NBC, New York Times, Fox, they're all the same. They all report the same stories because they're not actually independent meaningfully. They serve the same function. That's why you can say something like, I heard it on the news, because they're all the same. It's the same news. They're controlled the same way and they serve the same function. And it doesn't matter who's writing the stories. In fact, you probably have no idea who writes any particular story. You just see that CNN tag and that's all that matters. It doesn't matter because they're all just compliant journalism majors. They're interchangeable, and they were pre-filtered by the process of getting a journalism degree. They're actually a kind of bureaucrat. And that's why these news outlets have a bureaucratic feel to them, because that's precisely what they are. Now, regarding police shootings, which is most of police killings, you know, the case of Floyd George, he wasn't shot, but whatever. We're talking about police killings, and the main way police kill people is by shooting. So the data on police shootings is going to reflect overall police killings. Blacks are, of course, overrepresented compared to their number. Okay, but they're not overrepresented based on homicide rate or as a percentage of people who shot the police. Blacks, 12.6% of the US population in 2019, but 29.3% of the people killed by cops where the race is known were black. However, blacks made up 34.09% of cop killers where the race is known. Whites and Hispanics combined make up 65.83% of the people killed by cops in shootings, and made up 63.64% of cop killers. In terms of the cop killers, the FBI doesn't distinguish whites from Hispanics, so the cop killer number is a combination of whites and Hispanics. If you separated whites from Hispanics, I suspect the white proportion in isolation would be lower. So it seems to line up, at least in the big picture. Blacks appear to simply be more aggressive towards cops if the rate of cop killing is a good indicator of overall aggression. Not saying that this is justified or anything, but it's a case against racial bias. Cops can still be assholes generally, they could be, but the point here is a racial bias. And whenever you do a proper analysis of data on this, racial bias doesn't come out once you consider behavior of groups, of demographic groups. So when a story piece is pushed by the controlled media, they only push one type of event, and that is when a white cop kills a black victim, or in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, it's white people killing a black man. Now, assuming all cops are white, which they're not, but if we assumed all cops are white, that would only happen 29% of the time in terms of who's killing who. Now, in 2018, don't have data from 2019, in 2018, whites and Hispanics were 77.1% of all police officers. If officers have an even racial distribution, this means that in all likelihood, only 22.38% of police killings involve white or Hispanic officers and a black victim. But in reality, black neighborhoods tend to have blacker police forces. Not as black as the neighborhoods they're policing. Police, as a rule, are whiter than the general population, but blacks are probably more likely to deal with a black cop than white people are. And since black cops are actually more likely than white cops to shoot a black person in a given encounter, this would all mean that the percentage of police killings that involve a white cop and a black victim is going to be less than 22.38% of the time. Also, take out the Hispanic number, whatever that is, it's going to be less as a result of that as well. So I don't know what the exact number is. It's probably going to be somewhere around 17% of all police killings involve a non-Hispanic white cop and a black victim. Although that's just an estimate based on percentages of the population. But we know for a fact that it's no more than 29%. Absolutely. And it's probably no more than 22.38%, almost certainly no more than 22.38%. And given the Hispanic proportion of the quote-unquote white cops, it's going to be less than that. And also given the fact that black people are more likely to interact with a black cop than a white person, that's going to drive that down even as non-Hispanic whites as a percentage of the cops who shoot blacks. And yet, that scenario where a non-Hispanic white cop kills a black person, that is all you ever see. That is the only scenario that is presented to you by the journalism major clubs. The question you should be asking is, why do these interchangeable journalism majors who work at controlled media orgs only highlight killings with a white cop and a black victim, when it happens that combination probably only around 17% of the time? Those who think that by protesting this, that you are fighting the system, honey, this is a system narrative that was presented to you. They want you mad about this. The only reason you are mad about this is because this was picked and highlighted and presented to you. That's why they're showing you this. Because Joe Biden is a trash candidate and they need to gin you up to vote for him, okay? You're being ginned up to believe in unreality because they need you to vote for a guy who has dementia, Joe. And that's why Donald Trump is sending the DOJ after those white guys who shot Ahmaud Arbery. Because Trump wants you to think he's on your side. He's not, and neither is Biden. But all this is just a game to get you ginned up to vote for Biden, and Trump is trying to counter that by posturing that he's on your side. Consider the free cash Trump mailed out that blacks got at disproportionate rates. The establishment doesn't want Trump, even though Trump isn't really doing anything meaningful to destroy the establishment, but they still don't like him. They want dementia head Biden because he's controllable, right? Just like the journalism majors at the alphabet soup controlled media orgs. They like having those journalism majors who can't make it on their own because then they're bound to the quote-unquote news agency like CNN, and they can then be controlled, and they then toe the line. They don't get too creative. They don't strike out on their own. They're in sort of the New York Times, Fox, NBC, CNN sort of plantation, that whole sort of system. And so they're presenting you with white cop, black victim stories in order to get you hopped up and angry, even though these are extremely rare events and don't even reflect racial bias once black behavior is taken into account. If you compare the percent of blacks killed by cops versus the blacks who commit homicides, blacks commit consistently about half of all homicides where the race of the perpetrator is known, and this is far less than the percentage that blacks make up among those killed by the cops. And I use homicide as an indicator of general criminality because with things like robbery and assault and rape, these are all subject to reporting variance and police leniency. And with homicide, there's no judgment call. There's a dead body, the crime happened. The only issue with homicide is who done it, but that's also a problem with any other crime. Homicide is at least free of the problem of determining if a crime occurred. So the closest lifeline to reality in terms of race differences in general criminality is going to be the homicide number. Now, one thing, and my opponents will bring up, are simulation experiments showing police bias against blacks. And, it looks like they have a point. Let me present the most recent and, in my opinion, the best one. It's the best one because it has the biggest sample size, it has the most sophisticated method. There's all sorts of reasons, and I'll explain it. This is from Lois James et al. In 2016. And he took 80 police officers, randomly selected police officers, and put them through 1,517 reaction scenarios where they were put in a sound-deadened room with HD screen and a light gun, right? So they had a light gun that they pointed at the screen, and it emitted a muzzle flash, and it fired a blank. So it would bang, it sounded like a gun. And then the screen would register where the police shot. The police must react to various scenarios presented to them, which involves white and black citizens. It's a controlled environment where the white and black actors on the screen behave identically, and they look at how the cops, right, I think 40 of them were presented scenarios with blacks, 40% of them were presented scenarios with whites. And the HD screens are large enough that they are life-size. The cop must then decide very quickly where and if to shoot. Now, in terms of speed of reaction in the cop shooting the person on the screen from a given baseline, they take 1.32 seconds to shoot the white person, but they only take 1.09 seconds to shoot the black person. Okay, so that looks like they're more trigger happy in shooting black people. What about error rates when the police shot someone in error when the citizen was not about to attack the officer? That is, they killed what is, according to the scenario, an innocent person. Well, they shot blacks in error 14% of the time, but they shot whites in error only 1% of the time, or in absolute numbers of all the simulations. The police shot whites in error 2 times, but blacks in error 54 times. Okay, so that looks like some anti-black racial bias. So this simulation data is evidence of some anti-black bias in the police force. Assuming these are a representative sample of police generally, we more or less extrapolate this onto all police, evidence of an anti-black bias. In a controlled setting, given identical behavior, cops will shoot blacks more, at least in a simulation. But consider that, based on homicide rates and the rates at which blacks kill cops, this may actually be a reflection of experience that ends up being unfair to black people who aren't violent, which is to say, most black people. So if you're a black person, but you're not aggressive or violent, then you're gonna suffer from this, right? Simply because cops are, quite frankly, playing the odds. Oh wait, I messed that up. I got the races mixed up in the simulation. Oh yeah, that's right. Cops were 14 times more likely to shoot a white non-violent citizen. Okay. Yeah, and they actually had the faster reaction time when shooting whites than when shooting blacks. Whoops. I got that mixed up. Well, what do you know? In a simulation setting, cops are more trigger happy against whites than against blacks. Well, there it is. There we have evidence of anti-white bias among police. Now, certainly if you accepted the simulation results as evidence of anti-black bias when the results were reversed, well, now you'll accept it as evidence of anti-white bias, right? I mean, you wouldn't start straining to find some methodological problem with it now that you know what the results are. I mean, you're not that predictable, are you? Now, you may be watching this and wanting me to talk specifically about Floyd George or Ahmaud Arbery or whatever. And okay, I'll go ahead. Here's the interracial homicide instances, black on white and white on black. And the Ahmaud Arbery is one of the whites killing blacks. So there it is. And here's the people killed by police in 2020. Floyd George is one of those. All right, I talked about those. In fact, I talk about these episodes more than they deserve. Right there was more than they deserve. If you're talking about these individual instances any more than I've talked about, you're giving it way more attention than it deserves. You're being controlled by institutional media, controlled media, that is putting these episodes in front of you and telling you what to care about and telling you what you're supposed to know. While we're talking about simulations, let's talk about a simulation involving other things, or simulations involving other things where blacks and whites engage in identical behavior and how they're evaluated. L.J. Zigarelle did a fun paper looking at 17 experiments that he could find that looked at how black and white people were treated and evaluated given otherwise identical behaviors or characteristics. So one of the paper he looked at was Prager and Fries, 2003, and he asked people how much government help this guy Michael should get based on all sorts of factors: employment, age, inheritance, criminal record. Both groups offered to give Michael more money, but both whites and blacks said that Michael should get more money if Michael was black. In the black condition, they both showed a pro-black bias. Both whites and blacks did. Given identical history, identical inheritance, identical everything, right? They say give the black guy more money. Oliver and Lee asked people to evaluate how fat someone was using computer images of black and white people who had otherwise identical bodies, right? These are identical bodies, just with a few black facial characteristics and white facial characteristics, and of course the skin color. On that, both blacks and whites rated blacks as being slightly fatter. Interestingly, blacks were more likely than whites to consider the black image fatter. Like, both blacks and whites considered the black person with an otherwise identical image as being fatter than the white person, but blacks to a higher degree. So blacks actually showed a more anti-black bias here than whites did. Cottrell and Newberg, 2004. This one is a little bit more difficult to explain. It involved measuring the subject's emotional response to a target racial group facing 7 different what I would call hardship scenarios. That's not the term they used in the study, but I think that's the best way to explain it. So 7 different hardship scenarios, and they looked at the subject's emotional reaction if the group were black or white. Now, both whites and blacks were more likely to favor their own race, but blacks favored their own race about 3 times as much. Oh, also, I'm not doing the bait and switch anymore. I'm not going to present the results one way and then say they're another anymore. That was a one-time thing. Okay, Bernard, 2005, gave little bios of various lawyers, being either male or female, or black or white, and the subjects were to rate how competent they thought the lawyer was. Both whites and blacks rated otherwise identical black lawyers as being more competent than white lawyers, right? They gave them characteristics, they gave them case history, they gave them win-loss ratios, they gave them all sorts of stuff. Otherwise identical lawyers, both whites and blacks rated the black lawyers as more competent. And they also rated women as being more competent than otherwise identical men. And it goes on and on. You can read the analysis if you want, linked in the description. Basically, across all 17 studies, whites showed a pro-black bias of about 0.1 standard deviation, while blacks showed a pro-black bias of about 0.3 standard deviations. Now, what this means, in a rather vulgar way, is that whites have to be at the 61.79th percentile to be considered as good as a black person to black people. And they have to be at the 53.98th percentile to be considered as good as a black person to other white people. Which is to say, for identical behavior or characteristics, blacks get bumped up 11.79 points out of 100 in terms of how other blacks perceive them. But blacks only get an extra 3.9 points for how white people perceive them. Not surprisingly, blacks tend to think that whites evaluate them too harshly, right? Because whites only give them 3.9 points, but blacks give them 11.79, so therefore whites are racist. See, that's how this works. Now, perhaps more germane to all this stuff that's in quote-unquote the news, or the news that you listen to and you're told to care about, is race and crime and cops and courts and studies on jurors. So another fun study was from Mitchell in 2005, and he looked at 34, well, it was a meta-analysis. Mitchell, 2005, looked at 34 studies in which people acted as jurors and voted on whether a given defendant was guilty and how long a sentence it should be. So over these 34 studies, blacks showed an in-group bias about 15 times larger than that of whites. In fact, whites showed virtually none. Right? These are jury simulations, and where they're basically presented a case. They're presented a white defendant, a black defendant, otherwise identical defense, identical circumstance, identical evidence. So they're controlling for all that stuff, and they're looking at how, if there's any racial bias in white jurors or black jurors. And what they found is massive racial bias among black jurors. I can't say what this means in terms of likelihood of not going to jail if you're black and you have a black or white jury, because it's 34 studies and they all have different conviction rates. But if you're white, you get virtually nothing from an all-white jury. If you're black, you get something. Again, these are studies with black and white defendants who are otherwise identical in charge, evidence, courtroom behavior. They also looked at racial bias in sentence length. White showed virtually no bias, while black showed a 0.731 standard deviation bias. Now, what this means in percentage terms is that blacks will sentence otherwise identical whites to the 76.73 percentile of what they would sentence blacks, right? Whereas a racially unbiased jury will sentence them at the 50th percentile. Whites will sentence otherwise identical blacks to the 53.09th percentile of what they would sentence the same person if they were white. So what this means is that blacks with a black jury get about 26.73 points, almost a quarter of the entire variation in sentence length if they have a black jury. But blacks get punished about 3.09% if they have an all-white jury. So you're not getting hardly any of an effect for whites, but you're getting a huge effect if you're black and you have a black jury. So a lot more racial bias among black jurors than among whites. Not surprisingly, black people consider white jurors to be really, really bigoted. Also, blacks have way higher recidivism rates, as in being a repeat offender. So even after controlling for recidivism risk factors, there actually remains a pure racial effects, i.e. blacks are more likely to be repeat offenders even with an identical recidivism score. And the recidivism score is what they use to sort of predict, they use all sorts of factors like family history, nature of the crime. They have a whole science, the science of being a repeat offender, the science of recidivism, and they give people a recidivism score. And even with the same score, blacks are more likely to be repeat offenders. So even if white jurors aren't thinking about that, whites may be effectively fair. Okay, which is to say the 3.09% racial bias that whites have is probably fair, or maybe even more than fair. The problem is that all these issues that I talk about here, they all converge and they reinforce each other. So you take racial favoritism, pro-black favoritism at the universities, at companies, government jobs, all known as affirmative action. You have to deal with the callback myth, right? The myth that employers don't hire someone if they have a black-sounding name. That's been shown to be a myth. You got to talk about slavery and colonialism and segregation in South Africa and the Congo, right? There's all these things that have to talk about, and that's why what I'm doing here, making this video, is kind of futile, because you have a whole system of thought. Okay, this video is going to have much of an effect because what you have is an overarching ideology with a whole bunch of oppression myths that rest on each other and reinforce each other. And so knocking out one or two here isn't going to tear down the entire fantasy structure. And it all converges, right? All these beliefs converge. That's the meaning of the term when people say, "Oh, this person is totally converged," right? They have all these beliefs that they all converge on each other, and it all acts as one system. So it's not. So when you criticize, like let's say you criticize the conventional narrative on slavery, colonialism, segregation, South Africa, and the Congo, Okay, it's not really 5 different topics. It's the same topic. It's the same convergent narrative because they all reinforce and they all sort of grow together or die together. Okay, let me put it this way: if you say, for example, that segregation was fine, there's nothing immoral about whites wanting to have their own neighborhood. Let's say you say that. What are you going to be called? You're going to be called a quote-unquote racist. And racist, in effect, only means whites, right? It only means white people not having enough of a positive view of black and brown, right? That's what it means. Or what would be a criticism of saying, well, blacks are being shot by police, but they're actually being shot less than their behavior warrants. What are you called if you say that? You call the same thing, racist. So it's all of a piece. It's all an overarching narrative. It's a single thing, right? These aren't actually separate issues. And I think at some level, everyone kind of knows that these are not separate issues, that this is all one overarching ideology. This is all one overarching narrative that is being critiqued. And the critiquers are, of course, called, heretics, communists, or race, whatever the term du jour is at your place and time in history. Whatever the heretic analog is at your place and time in history. I think I'll end on this. Your perception of discrimination does not mean that you are discriminated against. From a Pew survey in 2016, younger black people reported having experienced discrimination more than those 65 and older. And blacks with college degrees report more discrimination than those without college degrees. Now, of course, this is false. Blacks without college degrees, while blacks in general aren't racially discriminated against, blacks with just a high school diploma almost certainly face more instances of racial discrimination to the extent they exist. Now, in reality, there's anti-black discrimination, pro-black discrimination, anti-white discrimination. There's discrimination all over the place, right? Discrimination, people discriminate all the time, and they racially discriminate all the time. The question is, what is the net effect, right? Are blacks more often discriminated against or discriminated in favor? Are whites more often discriminated against or discriminated in favor? That's how you need to look at this, because that's how the world actually works, right? It's not like everyone is either neutral or everyone is uniformly mildly anti-white or mildly anti-black. What's actually happening in the real world is people have racial biases going in all directions all the time. Okay, when I say blacks have a pro-black or anti-white, when I say whites have a pro-black or anti-white bias of about 1/10 of a standard deviation, I don't mean that all whites have that mild pro-black bias. I'm saying that whites, on the whole, it averages out to 1/10 of a standard deviation pro-black bias or anti-white bias, whichever way you want to look at it. Let's keep going. An NPR survey in 2017 asked blacks if they were ever, or a family member was ever, unfairly stopped or treated by the police. Those 65 or older, i.e. those who were born before civil rights, they were the least likely to say that they were unfairly stopped by police or a family member was unfairly stopped by police. And blacks in suburban areas are more likely to say that they were unfairly stopped, while blacks in the hood were less likely to say so. What this shows is that your belief that you were treated unfairly, it's a product of conditioning. If anyone was being unfairly harassed by the cops, it's going to be blacks in urban areas, and it's going to be the less educated ones who don't get into the urban areas. And older blacks, according to the mythology surrounding segregation, should have been harassed by cops the most. But what actually happened, what you're actually seeing, is that older blacks, they weren't told that they were oppressed as much as blacks are today. They were to a lesser extent, but they weren't told that they were oppressed as much as you are. And urban blacks, who are less educated and watch less controlled media, they don't hear about how oppressed they are as much as suburban blacks do, who are more educated. They watch, the journalism blogs, right? They watch CNN and Fox and stuff, right? And so they're told that they're oppressed. So you believe you're oppressed because you're told you're oppressed. There's no relation to actual oppression. This principle is also seen among women. From a Pew survey in 2017, the more quote-unquote educated, years in school, a woman is, the more likely she is to perceive oppression. even though, I mean, if any group of women is being on net oppressed, right, which I don't think is the case at all for any class of women, but according to the narrative, it should be the least educated women who are the most oppressed. But that's not what you see here. The variable here is exposure to ideology. It's perception. And of course, we look at Republican versus Democrat. Democrat women perceive more oppression because their ideology tells them they are oppressed. Do you think Republican women are more or less oppressed than Democrat women? I mean, neither are oppressed, but Republican women probably have fewer, bonus points for being a woman than Democrat women, and yet they're less likely to say they're oppressed. And this is actually a dampening effect because Republicans actually have higher levels of education than Democrats. This is true. I'll post a link saying that this is true in the description. Sorry if that rustles your jimmies. Like, sorry, not sorry. But this is true. So the effects of going to college, isolated from ideology, are going to be higher because Republicans are actually more likely to go to college. So if you have a Democrat woman who goes to college and gets a post-grad, she is going to think she is the most oppressed person on the planet. That is a recipe for believing you're oppressed. Being a Democrat and spending lots and lots of years in college, getting a post-grad, you are going to believe that the world is out to get you. If you're a Republican woman who doesn't go to college, you're not going to perceive yourself as being oppressed at all, right? Because you have the least exposure to those narratives. And so all you're dealing with is the world as it's actually presented in front of you. This is also seen by generation cohort, of which gender is thought to have it easier. Older generations see women as having it easier, while starting with millennials, the perception is that men have it easier. Again, it's a matter of ideology. It has nothing to do with reality. This is also seen among Hispanics from a Pew poll in 2016. Older Hispanics are less likely to perceive discrimination, and foreign-born are less likely to perceive discrimination than U.S.-born. Now, according to oppression narratives, foreign-born Hispanics from, say, the 1970s should certainly have been more oppressed than U.S.-born Hispanics today. And yet, that's not what they say. That's not what they believe, because it's all just perception. Foreign-born Hispanics in the 1970s weren't told that they were oppressed. U.S.-born Hispanics today are told that they're oppressed, and people believe what they're told by the institutions that they, for whatever reason, believe as authoritative, right? Like the journalism clubs, like CNN, that's authoritative. From Harvard in 2017, Latinos saying that they were unfairly stopped by police, 42% with a college degree say they were unfairly stopped, while only 25% with high school or less say they were ever unfairly stopped. Again, it's in all likelihood, if any of these groups were unfairly stopped, right, and there's a chance that none of them were in reality, but if any group was being unfairly stopped, it was probably the ones with a high school degree or less, right? Not the ones with a college degree, right? But the college degrees say they were stopped more because they went to college and they were told about how oppressed they are. Blacks are more likely to believe they are discriminated against when interacting with police or trying to vote if they live in a majority black area than in a majority white areas. But if they're in a majority black area, who's doing the discriminating? According to the oppression narrative, shouldn't blacks be most oppressed when they're surrounded by whites? This difference in perception makes sense when you recognize that it's just a result of the spread of ideology, right? When blacks are around blacks, the ideology spreads more than it does when blacks are around whites. It has nothing to do with any actual oppression, because plot twist, there is none. And that's a good point to end on. Now, you can tell stories about some white guy who doesn't like black people or Mexicans or whatever, but those stories are meaningless without considering the net effect. Because there are also white people who are anti-white, blacks who are anti-white, blacks who are anti-black, rather fewer of those, and they get ostracized massively. Hispanics who are anti-Hispanic, Hispanics who are anti-white. And so pointing out that this or that incident happened, like a thing happened, well, that doesn't mean anything. You have to look at the whole effect. And when you do, when you look at the whole track of things, well, if you're black, probably if you're Hispanic, but certainly if you're black, well, it's good news. You're not actually oppressed. Your life and all of its outcomes, that's you. This is you. right? It's not something that's being done to you by others. If anything, the system is pumping you up, is helping you out in any little way it can. But the effects of anti-white policies and pro-black policies, the effects of these things are actually pretty marginal. There's no real big effect in any of systemic racism or anything, right? There's probably a mild anti-white effect and a mild pro-black effect, but nothing that's going to affect your life outcomes by like 1 or 2 percentage points, right? So the effects are small. What's actually happening is that where you are, that's you. Okay, it's you. The system isn't really having much of an effect on you. Now, the deeper cut is that you never were oppressed, and that it is in fact always been you. But that's a whole. I mean, this video would go on for a few hours to go through all that. You can perceive yourself as being put upon no matter what, and whether or not you perceive yourself as being put upon is today entirely a function of your conditioning. Are you a Democrat or Republican? How old are you? Did you go to college? How many years did you go into college? Do you live in a majority black or majority white neighborhood? Those factors right there, those are going to more or less determine how oppressed you think you are. It's going to explain about 70 to 80% of how oppressed you think you are. Now, there's going to be some special snowflakes who, despite being a Democrat in an all-black area with a post-grad, they're not going to think that blacks are oppressed, right? You'll get the oddball here and there. But on the whole, these factors are going to more or less determine how oppressed you think you are. None of it's real. Keep in mind, you didn't think you were oppressed before any of this was told to you. And this is an experience that black and brown people have, is learning that they are oppressed. And the process of learning that they are oppressed, they have to be told it. They have to go to a class. They have to see a controlled media story, right? They have to see, like Rodney King or something. They have to see, it has to be told to them, right? They don't pick it up through their lived experience. That's the great irony of these claims about lived experience, is that it has positively zero to do with lived experience, right? Because those blacks and Hispanics who are the least connected to propaganda narrative, who aren't on Twitter, for example, they are the least likely to believe they are oppressed. The ones whose lives are most a function of lived experience are the least likely to think they're oppressed. So you have to be told this. This is something that is put into your brain from the top down. Right? This is a controlled narrative pushed onto you. It's not natural. It's not organic to you, right? It's something that someone else told you to believe, and that's why you believe it. And there's also the problem of how you experience white people in reality versus what the journalism bureaucracies tell you in the run-up to an election. Because of this, you have to say things like, oh, it's the cops, or it's corporations, or, oh, it's those neo-Nazis somewhere over the rainbow, right? It's like that one kid in your class who drew swastikas on the desk, right? He's the source of all your misfortunes, or something ridiculous like that, right? It's some hidden white person. It's not it's some ridiculously small minority of white people, right? Because the white people that you actually know aren't unfair to you, probably, for the most part. I mean, look, every person's a person, okay? But for the most part, this is true. So it has to be institutional racism. But all the institutions have pro-black discrimination. They have affirmative action, right? So what kind of institutional discrimination could there possibly be, right? Or it's implicit racism. But you look at any study that looks at, pro-black or anti-black or pro-white or anti-white bias on all sorts of things, in terms of, oh, how competent is this person? Oh, how much does this person deserve getting money, right? Except for a few minor things like how fat they believe you to be, it's all pro-black bias. And any simulation shows that cops are less likely to pull the trigger on a black person for given identical behavior than they are on a white person. And if you look at how many blacks are killed by police and compare that to the homicide rate and compare that to the percentage of cop killers are black, if anything, blacks are shot less than their proportion in those things. Blacks are underrepresented. Blacks, are shot less than they quote unquote should be. I don't think anyone should be shot, but, in the ratio, I mean. So because of all this, you know, so it has to be something hidden, right? Because white people in your day-to-day life aren't actually biased, right? But, you know, so maybe we're secretly oppressing you. Maybe we don't even know that we're doing it. I don't even know that I'm doing it. Somehow I'm oppressing black people by, well, maybe I'm oppressing black people by making these videos. But in general, in the big picture, you know, we talk about white privilege, the invisible knapsack. Well, it's invisible because it doesn't exist.
Because people failed to accept and explore the alternative hypothesis, which turned out to be factually correct.
Who does that? Who calls somebody by their first, middle, and last name? Isn't that kind of weird? Isn't that kind of culty? He's not Martin, but Martin Luther King. Contrary to what Republicans would like to imagine, Martin supported reparations and he supported affirmative action.
And this is what we are faced with. And this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
Any attempts by Republicans to make Martin into something their own is both false and a recipe for defeat. Now, it's hard to remember when the first accusations were made, but at least since the 1970s, probably well before that, there were claims that Martin was a communist, not a real doctor, and that he had sex orgy parties. In 1991, after around 2 decades of denial, Boston University finally admitted that Martin plagiarized parts of his PhD thesis. Boston University formed a committee to investigate the plagiarism and found that Martin stole, verbatim, 33% of his dissertation, 45% of the first half, and 21% of the second half from another Boston University student, Jack Boozer. And that's just what the committee found. I suspect if a more hostile committee was looking at Martin's thesis, they would have found more plagiarism than that. Not surprisingly, the Boston University committee did not recommend revoking King's doctorate, despite a third of it being proven to be plagiarized. But this makes perfect sense, given that his speeches were written by others. For example, Martin's I Have a Dream speech was written by